We quickly want to take you to Minneapolis, where we're about to find out if 2 police officers there will be charged in the fatal shooting of a black man named Jamar Clark. Let's listen.
Analysis of the facts of this case. Various video recordings, complete recordings, the DNA reports, the autopsy report, all of the police reports and interviews. This way, you can review virtually every piece of material that we reviewed before making our charging decisions, and you can draw your own conclusions. This level of transparency is unprecedented. And finally, every governmental entity, especially those in public safety and justice, must continually evaluate their procedures to make sure they meet the challenges of today and not merely reflect the practices of yesterday. This office has undertaken such a review, and our in-depth analysis of and our decision not to use the grand jury in police-involved shootings. By making this tough charging decision ourselves, we're increasing the level of accountability and transparency our communities deserve from us. Police have a very difficult job. They are often required to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. Nationally, this job has only become more challenging due to the lack of trust between the community and the police. That's why I believe police departments must regularly review their practices and procedures to make sure they are more effective and just in serving all of our communities. In late January, police chiefs from the major cities across this country, including Minneapolis and St. Paul, gathered in Washington, D.C. at the Police Executive Research Forum. In their own words, they called for, quote, drastic change in training and policies within the police departments in order to dramatically cut the number of officer-involved fatal shootings. I support the efforts of the Minneapolis Police Department to review their past practices and strive for improvements through enhanced training and revised procedures. This case and other recent police shooting cases around the country reinforce my belief that revised police training and practices must emphasize the de-escalation wherever possible. Police must use discussions, negotiations, and peaceful interventions first. They must be willing to tactically withdraw and slow down volatile situations. And if force is necessary, they need to use the lowest level of force possible. Physical restraint, mace, tasers, for example, before threatening to use or actually using deadly force. We simply must reduce the number of situations where guns are discharged by police. This will not only save lives of members of the community, but it will also protect police officers from the tragedy that they face when duty requires them to take a life of another. Now, I want to be very clear. These remarks are not a reflection on the actions of Officers Ringingberg or Schwartzy on November 15, 2015. This case is not at all similar to some of those seen around the country, in Chicago, in Cleveland, or North Charleston, South Carolina. These officers were called upon to respond to a person who had assaulted his girlfriend and interfered with the paramedics who were trying to assist her. These officers did not have the opportunity to withdraw or to negotiate. Finally, let me say that all of us have a role in reducing community violence. This responsibility rests with us individually and collectively. We know that violence begets more violence. The genius of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. is that they saw old ways did not work, that nonviolence could only defeat violence. We all must stop using violence against those we love and those we do not love. We must be more civil when we speak to each other, and this includes interactions between the community and the police. Please, lower the volume. Let us show respect towards every person, no matter how much we may dislike them. All of us, prosecutors, police, community, have so much work to do to reduce the violence. Only by working together can we accomplish this goal. Now, let me turn to the law that controls a prosecutor's review of this or any other homicide. I will begin with the controlling Minnesota statutes and case law. In order to bring a charge against a police officer for using deadly force, the state must be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer's use of deadly force was not justified. This legal standard remains the same, regardless of whether the factual determination is made by the prosecutor or by the grand jury. In order to charge second-degree manslaughter, the state must be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused person acted with culpable negligence in creating an unreasonable risk of death or great bodily harm. Culpable negligence has been defined by the Minnesota courts to mean acts that are grossly negligent combined with an element of recklessness. In order to charge second-degree murder, the state must be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused intended to cause the death of the victim. In order to charge first-degree murder, the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt not only that the accused intended to cause the victim's death, but also that the action was premeditated. Those are standards society recognizes when it comes to holding one criminally responsible for killing another. The statute authorizing a police officer's use of deadly force in self-defense or defense of others is similar to that of civilians. However, courts have interpreted the provision for law enforcement in a way that sets a high bar for obtaining a criminal conviction against a police officer for use of force. Under Minnesota statute 609.066, subdivision 2, police officers in Minnesota are justified in using deadly force in the line of duty when it is necessary to protect the officer or another person from apparent death or great bodily harm. This statute provides a significant defense to criminal charges against an officer for use of deadly force. In Graham versus Connor, the United States Supreme Court held that the use of deadly force by a police officer must be evaluated from the perspective of a reasonable police officer on the scene and in the same circumstance. Reasonableness of police use of force cannot be evaluated from the perspective of a civilian, nor can it be evaluated with a more clear vision of 20/20 hindsight. The court further said in Graham that the fact that the law enforcement officers often are required to react quickly in tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving situations needs to be taken into account in determining reasonableness. Since Graham, the Supreme Court has narrowed the analysis to focus on the exact moment the force was applied. If the evidence in a particular case shows the officer's use of deadly force was justified by the statute and under the Graham decision, criminal charges against that officer for manslaughter or murder cannot be brought. The only time manslaughter or murder charges can be filed against a police officer, regardless of who makes the charging decision, is when the use of deadly force is not justified. To repeat, the evidence must show unreasonable conduct by the police, utilizing the perspective of police officers, and the use of deadly force was not necessary to protect the officer or the public from a threat of great harm or death. Let me now trace a chronology of the events November 14th and 15th. The events leading up to the tragic death of 24-year-old Jamar Clark in the early morning hours of November 15th occurred near 1611 Plymouth Avenue in North Minneapolis. The addresses on the south side of this block consisted of an apartment building attached by breezeway to townhomes. The Elks Lodge, a social club, is located across the street from 1611 Plymouth on the north side of the block. November 15th was a warm evening, and many residents were out in the balcony on the south side enjoying the evening. Patrons of the Elks Club were, at this time, starting to leave that establishment. On the evening of November 14th, 2015, a number of friends and family were hosting a birthday party from Akeelia Sharp, age 39, in apartment 103 at 1611 Plymouth Avenue. Jamar Clark was present with his girlfriend, Rayanne Hayes, age 41, and a number of his relatives. Late in the evening, Sharp and her husband started arguing in the hallway. Rayanne Hayes attempted to break up the argument, and Jamar Clark grabbed her. Hayes and Clark then fought, and Hayes injured her ankle in the fight. During this altercation, both Clark and Hayes suffered facial wounds which bled. At 12:20 a.m. on November 15th, Rayanne Hayes called 911 and asked the paramedics to come to her daughter's apartment in that building. EMS paramedics Tyler Haskell and Wellesley Thomas responded to the call. They parked their ambulance on the south side of Plymouth Avenue in front of 1611 Plymouth. Their paramedics entered the building and went to apartment 204, where they found Hayes. Ms. Hayes was intoxicated and unable to walk. Her lip was split, she had bruising on her left eye, and an abrasion on her nose. The paramedics put Hayes into a stair chair to carry her down the stairs. As the paramedics carried Hayes out of the building, they saw Jamar Clark standing outside the building and, quote, acting kind of odd, end quote. As they walked past Clark, Hayes said, quote, "That's the guy who did this to me," end quote. The paramedics radioed for police backup because the apparent assailant was on the scene. As the paramedics were transferring Hayes from this chair to a stretcher to load her in the ambulance, Clark approached them saying he was her son. Hayes said he was not her son. Clark then began calling paramedic Thompson a pussy, a bitch, and told Hayes that he was going to come to see her. The paramedics loaded Hayes into the ambulance and locked the door. Thompson and Haskell were very afraid at this point. Clark began knocking on the ambulance door, trying to get into the ambulance. Shortly after Hayes and the paramedics locked themselves in the ambulance, EMS Deputy Chief Michael Trullinger, who was aware of the paramedics' call for assistance by the police, arrived on the scene. Trullinger saw Clark tapping in the back of the ambulance, saying his mother was in there. Clark advised Trullinger his name was Darius. Clark alternated between throwing his hands in the air and putting his hands in his pocket. Trullinger, a Marine Corps veteran, was concerned by Clark's body language. Trullinger asked Clark to step aside. Clark moved a few steps away but kept fidgeting and taking his hands in and out of his pockets. Clark, at that evening, was wearing a long-sleeve sweatshirt and a jacket. Trullinger noted that Clark was crying at times and his emotions appeared to be rapidly changing. Because of new security features in the ambulance, the paramedics could not move from the patient area in the back to the driver's area without getting out the side door of the ambulance. In essence, the ambulance carrying Hayes could not leave for the hospital because the driver was caught locked in the back because of their concern of the issues raised by Mr. Clark. Soon thereafter, MPD officers Schwartzy and Riggenberg arrived on the scene from the 4th Precinct Station House, which is only 3 blocks away from 1611 Plymouth. They parked behind EMS Supervisor Trullinger's Suburban. Because the officers were so close to 1611 Plymouth and the call was for ambulance assistance, they did not activate the lights and siren, which in turn means their squad car video camera was not automatically engaged. Trullinger met the officers and told them that the person in the ambulance was assaulted by the person on the curb, who was also interfering with treatment by the paramedics. At 12:49 a.m. on November 15th, officers Riggenberg and Schwartzy approached Clark and noticed his hands were in his jacket pocket. They told him to take his hands out of his pocket. He refused. Riggenberg then took his gun out and held it down alongside his leg, with the barrel pointed towards the ground. He did not point it at Clark or at any other individual. Clark started yelling, quote, "What's the pistol for?" end quote. The officers again and repeatedly told Clark to take his hands out of his pockets, and he continued to refuse to do so. Riggenberg put his gun back in the holster and grab Clark's right wrist, while Schwartzy grabbed Clark's left hand. Schwartzy then took his handcuffs out, but said he was not able to get them on Clark. In the ensuing struggle, Schwartzy dropped the cuffs. Ringenberg had been trained in his prior work as a police officer in San Diego to take a suspect to the ground when he or she resisted being handcuffed because it was believed to be a safe way to put handcuffs on. After Clark resisted being handcuffed standing up, Ringenberg reached his arm around Clark's chest and neck and took him to the ground. This occurred at 12:49:29 a.m. Ringenberg landed on his side on top of Clark, who was on his back. In essence, Clark's back was to the ground and Ringenberg's back was to Clark's stomach. Ringenberg said he tried to move away from Clark to get in position to handcuff him. Ringenberg felt his gun go from his right hip to the small of his back and told Schwartzy, "He's got my gun." Ringenberg said he reached back to the top of his gun and felt Clark's whole hand on the gun. Ringenberg repeatedly told his partner Schwartzy, "He's got my gun, he's got my gun." Ringenberg recalled hearing Schwartzy tell Clark to let go of the gun or Schwartzy would shoot. Ringenberg heard Clark say, quote, "I'm ready to die," end quote. Ringenberg said, quote, "That was the worst feeling ever because my heart just sank," end quote. Ringenberg believed he was going to die at this point because he had no control over his gun. Ringenberg felt that Clark didn't care what happened to him and remember thinking he didn't want his partner to die with the gun. After Ringenberg heard the run go off, he was able to roll over and stand up. Schwartzy said that as the officers approached Clark, Clark had, quote, "this 1,000-yard stare," end quote. And by the way, all of these quotes are taken directly from police reports, statements of either civilians or police, and they will be available on our website later today. Schwartzy said that after Ringenberg used the takedown maneuver, Schwartzy maintained control of Clark's left hand and was waiting for Ringenberg to turn Clark over so they could handcuff him. Schwartzy heard Ringenberg say, quote, "He's got my gun," end quote, in a very, quote, stern, excited, very serious, end quote, tone. Schwartzy, who had had his handcuffs out, dropped the handcuffs in the ground and took out his gun. Schwartzy said he put the gun to the edge of Clark's mouth and said, "Let go or I'm going to shoot you," end quote. Schwartzy recalls Clark looking directly at him and saying, quote, "I'm ready to die," end quote. Schwartzy said the, quote, "only thing I could think of to do was to save our lives and everyone else in the immediate area, so I pulled the trigger," end quote. Schwartzy said the gun did not fire because the slide was only partially pulled back. Schwartzy heard Ringenberg saying, "Shoot him," in a panicked voice, so Schwartzy pulled the trigger again, and the gun fired. Clark was shot approximately 61 seconds after the police first approached. Trullinger, as I stated earlier, had briefed the officers when they arrived at the scene. Trullinger then went into the ambulance containing Hayes, the other paramedics. Trullinger asked Hayes if the person outside was her son. She said he was not. He was her boyfriend, and he had beaten her up. Trullinger and the paramedics then heard a gunshot. They hit the floor momentarily, and then Trullinger looked out to see the officers standing up and spread apart. Trullinger saw Clark on his back on the ground, bleeding with his arms to the side, and Trullinger called for another ambulance. The ambulance with Hayes then left for North Memorial Medical Center. Trullinger rushed to Clark, checked his pulse, ran to his truck to get his trauma bag. Trullinger noticed a pair of handcuffs on the ground near Clark, somewhere near his hips. Hennepin County Medical Center paramedics Maria Hill and Tyler Lupkes responded to the scene in the second ambulance, arriving at 12:54:49 a.m. and saw Trullinger assisting Clark. Hill asked MPD officer Reamer for help checking Clark for weapons, and no weapons were found. As EMS paramedics Hill and Lupke's went to move Clark to a stretcher, they noticed open handcuffs in the grass near Clark's right side. Lupke's grabbed the handcuffs by the hinge and moved them out of the way so the paramedics could put Clark on the stretcher. Clark was loaded on the stretcher and quickly into the ambulance to take it to Hennepin County Medical Center. Officer Schwartzky of the 4th Precinct arrived at the scene within minutes of the shooting. The scene had become very chaotic, with 50 to 60 people in the immediate area, many yelling at the police. With the other officers arriving to take control of the scene, Schwartzky was concerned for the safety of Schwartzy and Ringenberg, so he removed them from the scene. Schwartzky took Schwartzy's firearm and moved Schwartzy and Ringenberg to his squad. Schwartzy was placed in the front and Ringenberg in the back. They did not discuss the incident on the short drive to the 4th Precinct. At the precinct, Schwartzy and Ringenberg were placed in separate offices according to procedure. Each officer was later read a public safety statement, which is meant to determine whether there is a weapon used or missing or other immediate safety concerns. Schwartzy said he had fired his weapon and the handcuffs were missing. Crime scene technicians later took photos of Schwartzy and Ringenberg collecting their firearms, as well as Ringenberg's duty belt, for forensic examination. Their uniforms were not connected at this time, but were later. After Clark was transported by an ambulance and the scene was secured, crime scene technicians examined the area where Clark was shot. They recovered a pair of handcuffs with the clasp open, medical items, and car keys from Schwartzy's Ringenberg squad. The ambulance used to transport Hayes was taken to the MPD forensic garage, processed for fingerprints and DNA and video recovery. The video from the second ambulance was also recovered. Those 2 videos will be shown to you later this morning. MPD crime lab personnel went to HCMC and photographed Clark, including photographs of his wrists. A number of witnesses were also identified at the scene. Those witnesses were transported to the homicide unit at Minneapolis Police, where homicide investigations were taken. When the officer went to see Clark approximately 3 a.m., he took pictures of Clark's wrists, of which no bruises are shown. He called a forensic scientist who came over and took additional picture of Clark's wrists, and no occlusions or bruises were shown. Several items of video evidence were also obtained. The video from the back of the ambulance in which Rayanne Hayes was transported, the video from the back of the ambulance which Jamar Clark was transported, video from a public housing camera, video from a police poll camera, video from 54 squad cars who responded to the Code 3 call, video and audio from a squad car in which officers Ringenberg and Schwartzy were transported to the 4th Precinct, video from Danny Blaylock, video from a known female, hard drive from the Elks Club Lodge camera later determined to be inoperable. You will see, as I said to you before, at the end of today's presentation, some of that video, and all of the video in complete unedited form will be available on the website later today. Autopsy of James Clark. He died November 16, 2015 at 9:32 p.m. The next day, an autopsy was conducted by Hennepin County Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Andrew Baker. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. A toxicology report showed that Clark had a blood alcohol level of 0.09 and THC in his blood as well. Dr. Baker carefully examined Clark's wrist externally and internally and determined there was, quote, no occult contusions, lay language says bruises, or other injuries suggested of restraint, end quote. In other words, there was no evidence of injuries from the handcuffs. Early in the morning of November 16th, pursuant to a recently adopted Minneapolis Police Department policy, which I support, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension took over the investigation into the death of Jamar Clark. Later that day, Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges asked the United States Department of Justice to join the investigation into the death of Jamar Clark. Later that day, Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges asked the United States Department of Justice to join the investigation into the death of Jamar Clark. The investigation included 122 BCA reports totaling 1,370 pages, an autopsy, 21 DNA reports, and 97 Minneapolis Police Department supplemental reports. In my review of each and every document, it took me 31 hours to read all of them. There were additional federal reports as well, which were part of our decision, but we do not have the capacity to release them. That's up to the feds. The BCA submitted its report to this office on February 10th. As is common practice, we asked for additional investigation, which the BCA promptly did. On March 16th, I announced that the charging decision on officer-involved shootings and deadly force cases resulting in death would no longer be submitted to a grand jury. Instead, the county attorney would make that determination, as is done with all other criminal cases that come to this office. I reviewed this case along with 3 very senior prosecutors and issued this report today. One of the primary issues in this case, and an important focus of our investigations, is whether Jamar Clark was handcuffed. There is no dispute that Officer Ringenberg took Clark to the ground. It is also clear that Ringenberg was on top of Clark after they went to the ground, and he remained there until Clark was shot by Officer Schwartzy. The question is whether Clark was handcuffed at the time he was taken to the ground and shot. There are conflicting eyewitness accounts regarding the presence of the handcuffs. Ringenberg, Schwartzy, and 10 other paramedic or law enforcement witnesses who observed Clark at the scene have stated that Clark was not handcuffed. By contrast, 20 civilian witnesses who provided information regarding handcuffs give differing versions. 2 said Clark was not handcuffed. 6 were uncertain if Clark was handcuffed, and 12 were certain that he was. Of these 12, they disagree as to whether Clark was handcuffed with his hands behind his back, hands in front of him, and some of them said he was only handcuffed on his left hand. It's not unusual after a traumatic event to have differing and often contradictory eyewitness statements. We see that in most of our cases. The fact that statements are contradictory does not mean in any way that a person is lying or trying to tell stories. In such cases, we prosecutors got to look to forensic evidence and all the statements and compare them where the people were in their access and their capacity to make their observation. In addition to lack of physical injuries to Clark's wrists, which would have occurred during a violent struggle if he had been handcuffed, other forensic evidence established that Clark was not handcuffed. Laboratory testing found the presence of Clark's DNA on Ringenberg's duty belt and the grip of Ringenberg's gun. The forensic evidence that Clark grabbed Ringenberg's holster is also strong corroboration that Clark was not handcuffed behind his back, as described by several of the witnesses, because if he was handcuffed behind his back, there's no way he could have used his hands to try to pull Ringenberg's gun out. Photos at the hospital show no handcuff injuries on Clark. As I stated earlier, on November 15th, homicide detectives visited Clark in the intensive care unit, took pictures, and saw no injuries. Forensic scientists also went 2 hours later and found no evidence of bruising, and those photographs will be made available in this report. This documented absence of obvious handcuff injuries hours after the incident is important corroboration that Clark was not handcuffed at the moment he was shot. On November 17th, Chief Hennepin County Medical Examiner Dr. Andrew Baker performed an autopsy. Baker said no occult contusions or other injuries suggestive of restraint. Dr. Baker's finding of no internal or external signs of handcuff injuries is consistent with the photos taken of Clark's wrists at the hospital. This forensic medical evidence Also strongly corroborates the statements of the officers that Clark was not handcuffed at the time he was struggling with Ringenberg and not handcuffed at the time he was shot. Schwartz's handcuffs were found in the grass near where Jamar Clark was shot. The handcuffs were recovered by MPD forensic scientist Nicole Lenway and ultimately taken to the BCA for forensic testing. The inside of the handcuffs were swabbed and examined for DNA. There was no DNA found inside the handcuffs. Blood was found outside of the handcuffs, and testing revealed it was a match to Clark. The blood spatter on the handcuffs was Clark's and was on only one side of the handcuffs. This is consistent with the officer's statements that the cuffs were never on Clark. Having fallen to the ground during the struggle, one will expect blood spatter only on one side. Further, had Clark been handcuffed behind his back, it seems highly unlikely blood could have spattered on the cuffs, as the entrance wound was towards the front of Clark's head and there is no exit wound. Clark's body, if he had handcuffs on, would have shielded the cuffs from blood under these circumstances. Officers Ringenberg and Schwartz gave statements that they attempted to handcuff Clark, but were never able to succeed, which is why Schwartz's handcuffs were found out and at the scene. The officers' statements are consistent. After Clark was taken to the hospital, Ringenberg and Schwartz were taken to the police station and separated. Their DNA samples were taken. When Lenway asked Ringenberg the standard questions about any DNA transfers, Ringenberg said that Clark had grabbed at my holster and my gun. Lenway then collected Ringenberg's duty belt as well. DNA swabs to be used as known samples were collected from Ringenberg and Schwartz, as well as other first responders. A known DNA sample was also taken from Jamar Clark. These DNA samples, together with the two firearms and Ringenberg's duty belt, were submitted to the BCA laboratory for evaluation. Forensic DNA testing on Ringenberg's duty belt shows mixtures of DNAs in several areas. James Clark DNA was found on Ringenberg's holster and mace holder. Clark's DNA was also found on the front left handcuff holder and the back left handcuff holder, located on Ringenberg's duty belt. And again, DNA testing conducted on the grip of Ringenberg's gun revealed Jamar Clark's DNA. The presence of Clark's DNA on the duty belt and the grip of the gun is strong forensic evidence of the officer's statements that Clark's hand was on the grip of Ringenberg's gun. Clark simply could not have been handcuffed and attempted to seize the gun while they were on the ground. Legal analysis. The evidence detailed above does not support the filing of criminal charges against Officer Dustin Schwartz or Mark Ringenberg for the fatal shooting of Jamar Clark. At the time he was shot, Clark was attempting to gain control of Ringenberg's firearm. Ringenberg reasonably believed that if Clark had succeeded in removing the weapon from his holster, Clark would have shot both officers, as well as exposing third parties to danger of injury by firearm. Ringenberg and Clark were resting on the ground in a position which rendered Ringenberg unable to remove Clark's hand from his firearm, now in the small of his back. Ringenberg communicated to Schwartz that Clark had his firearm and that Schwartz should shoot Clark. Schwartz did. His actions were reasonable given both his observations and Ringenberg's plea. Eyewitness testimony was contradictory on this central issue. Those who have stated that Clark was handcuffed are themselves contradictory. Some say one wrist, some say two. Some suggest he was handcuffed in the front of his body, some in the back, casting doubt on the statements without reference to physical evidence. Forensic evidence and video evidence both support the belief that Clark was not handcuffed at any time through the altercation. Let me now talk a bit about use of deadly force and the statute that applies there. When police first encountered Clark on November 15th, they knew, 1, he was the alleged assailant in a domestic assault which resulted in need for medical attention by the victim. 2, he had interfered with the EMS personnel to the degree that they requested police intervention. 3, as the police approached Clark, his hands were in his jacket pocket and he refused directives to remove them from the pockets. And 4, when they tried to handcuff him, he resisted arrest, compelling the use of force. trying to put handcuffs on him. When Clark was forcibly taken to the ground by Ringenberg, Clark continued to resist by struggling with Ringenberg. Because they had fallen with Clark on his back and Ringenberg's back to Clark's front, Clark was able to reach the grip of Ringenberg's firearm, on which Ringenberg could feel Clark pulling. Ringenberg was aware Clark had his hand on the grip as he was able to reach behind himself and feel Clark's whole hand on the grip. He was unable to remove Clark's hand from the grip. Recognizing that Clark had control of his weapon, Ringenberg told Schwartzy multiple times that Clark had his gun. Finally, Ringenberg told Schwartzy more than once to shoot Clark. Schwartzy said that Ringenberg's voice had a tone on it that was, quote, the most sincere, panicked voice I'd ever heard, end quote. Schwartzy told Clark he was going to shoot him if he did not let go. Clark responded, I'm ready to die, end quote. Schwartzy's first attempt failed, but in the second attempt, he shot and killed Jamar Clark. The use of deadly force is justified if the officer reasonably believes that death or great bodily harm to himself or another will likely result if he does not act. In this case, Officer Ringenberg subjectively believed that Clark had or was in the process of obtaining control of his weapon, and that were Clark able to remove the weapon from its holster, both Ringenberg and Schwartzy likely would be shot. Ringenberg's subjective belief is also objectively reasonable. First, Clark's DNA was found on Ringenberg's gun, mace container, and his holster. Next, the keepers designed to keep Ringenberg's utility belt in place had become unsnapped. Moreover, when Ringenberg is free of Clark, the video clearly shows that his belt is turned in such a way that his gun is behind his back. As he stands, Ringenberg can be seen adjusting his duty belt back to its normal situation. These facts corroborate Ringenberg's belief that Clark was forcibly pulling on his belt and holding his gun, and it was objectively reasonable to believe he was attempting to remove it. Minnesota Statute 609.504 provides that disarming or attempting to disarm a police officer is a felony. An attempt to obtain control of the firearm of a peace officer presents a grave danger to the peace officer and bystanders. The attempt alone suggests a willingness to use a firearm if it is successfully removed from the holster. Once removed, an assailant can instantaneously begin firing the weapon. There is no time for recovery in that situation. Even if the person is not ultimately successful, an attempt to gain control of an officer's weapon creates a significant risk of injury. Ringenberg and Schwartzy were interviewed separately. Both stated they believed that without the use of deadly force, Clark would have obtained possession of Ringenberg's firearm. Each stated their independent fear of being shot. Accordingly, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office has concluded that criminal charges are not warranted against either Officer Mark Ringenberg or Officer Dustin Schwartzy. I will now play the video from that evening. As I said earlier, the complete videos will be on the Hennepin County Attorney's Office website later today. Right now, you're going to see key portions of a civilian's video and the videos taken from the back of both the ambulance that treated Rayon Hayes and the second ambulance that treated Jamar Clark. These ambulance videos have been shortened to relevant parts. There are other police videos and civilian videos that simply do not reflect whatsoever what happened at the moment of the shooting or just before. Some of these videos show what happened after, which under Supreme Court precedent is essentially irrelevant to the question of whether criminal charges should be brought. The complete videos will be on the website. You don't have to trust my editing, but I wanted to do it in a way that we could focus on the key parts. The first video was taken by civilian Danny Blaylock. All right, that's taken, just to help interpret it, that's taken from the north side of Plymouth Avenue at 1611, from the side where the Elks Club is, and it's down pointing towards the area where Officers Riggenberg and Schwartzy were, and Mr. Clark is lying on the ground. It's obviously very difficult to see much. What you can do if you look at it tonight yourself, you can stop it frame by frame. I wanted you to see something from a civilian video that showed a little bit about what the scene was like, and you also for people to see how difficult it is to interpret what happened from videos. I know that many people think videos are the panacea and will resolve all disputes in every criminal situation. That simply isn't true. There are videos that sometimes do show that. Sometimes when an officer's wearing a body camera, or there's a clear view from a squad car video. That doesn't happen all the time, and it didn't happen here. But again, so you can draw your own conclusions, what we're going to do is to put all the videos up, and they'll be up later this afternoon. All right, the second one is a video with Ruth Ann Hayes being moved to the ambulance, okay? Now that's the side of the ambulance. Those are the two MTs, and she is there on the chair, and you will see at the top left-hand corner, Jamar Clark enter the scene. You'll see his legs and his coat. You can see the officer speaking to Clark, who's just off camera. See him way off to the far left-hand side. There he is. Okay, the third is also from the same ambulance, and you can see Jamar Clark at the foot of the ambulance. Before we play, the total ambulance tape is like 25 minutes long. It shows the ambulance when it first pulled up. It shows this. The clip of Jamar at the back of the ambulance is approximately 5 minutes. You can look at it all on the website. We'll show you a piece of it so you see what happened. Okay? There's Mr. Clark. You can also see the clothes he's wearing. Can you stop that a minute, Chuck? At the bottom, you saw discussion that it was reversed. I'm not a technology person, but what I understand is the cameras, the back of the ambulance, are reversed. So although the people were standing on the left side, as you see here, the original video shows them on the right-hand side. So they've been transposed as best we can tell for real life. Okay, go ahead, Chuck. You see that comment on the bottom here. See reversed, and then there's the time, and that's Greenwich Mean Time. So that's 6:42:50, or here in Minnesota, that's 12:42:56. Okay, Chuck, let's go on to the next room. That's Clark at the doors. The next will be the supervisor in the white shirt. That's Deputy Chief EMS Chief Trulinger, who comes to the scene. That's Trulinger. You'll see Clark is off to the left side. You'll see him in a minute.
Josh Elliott alongside CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman as we've been watching this presentation made by Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman, who just moments ago announced his decision to not press charges, bring charges against two police officers who had been implicated in the shooting death of 24-year-old Jamar Clark last November 15th. It has been an exhaustive and very thorough presentation, as we've seen here. Ricky, as we watch again, the attorney roll a bit of the video that will all be posted, he said, on the website in question to be viewed by anybody who wants to see it. Just one moment, actually, Ricky. Here comes the most important video in question. Let's take a look.
Okay. Okay. So that's Trulinger, and that's Officer Ringenberg, and that's Officer Schwarzy at the top. There's Clark's feet.
How's that resisted?
That was so violent. That was murder. That was a violent threat.
Why don't we play it through and we'll run it a second time? Okay.
That was very violent. Very violent. We didn't hear that in the narrative about what happened.
You can, excuse me, that's the Officer Ringenberg's feet. He's obviously on his back and he's kicking his feet. Now, Ringenberg's still trying to get up, and now he does. And he's adjusting his belt. Sir, I know there's lots of people who want to talk, and I'm certainly willing to have people take this podium. I'd be glad to answer a couple of questions.
You can't get reelected in 2018.
Sir?
I've got a question. You said there was DNA evidence, but there is fingerprints filed on the gun or the belt.
Just DNA evidence, no fingerprints. And that's kind of not unusual. You don't, excuse me, just, may I finish this question first? I'll be glad to answer your question just a moment. Normally, fingerprints are a lot harder to get off a gun normally. Yes, ma'am, you had a question?
Is it normal to put two officers in a car together after they've killed someone? Does that not allow them to create a story? Does that not allow them to create a narrative?
There is,
Two criminals
excuse me.
together. Why would you put two cops together that just killed someone? Alone. Is that normal?
Yeah.
Somebody let them sit together in a car alone without body cameras?
May I answer your question?
Go
okay?
Can I have a follow-up after her question?
You certainly may. The camera was on in the office, in the vehicle that transported the two officers away, okay? It showed in the back seat where Officer Riggenberg was. The audio shows no conversations between those two officers in the car. When they got to the police station, they were separated and put in separate offices as is standard procedure.
Can you
Okay.
publish that video also?
I'm sorry?
Can you publish that video also?
Yeah, I don't, yes, we will. If we don't have it today, we'll put it up as soon as we can get it. Nikema?
Audio. So,
It's the audio and the video, if we can.
I'm struck by a couple things. Number one, in your narrative, you didn't talk about the fact that he was violently slammed from behind by a police officer. That was shocking to me to see that in a chokehold after you led everyone to believe that Jamar Clark was the aggressor. So I definitely take issue with that. Number two, what role did the Minneapolis Police Department play in investigating this incident prior to the involvement of the BCA?
Let me answer your second question first. The Minneapolis police did take a number of items that night. As I understand it, and I could stand to be corrected at the precise time. The next morning, the MPD was pulled off the case and the BCA began it. So, for example, as I stated, it was an MPD officer who went to the hospital to take pictures of Mr. Clark's wrists. And it was an MPD forensic officer who went back to take more pictures. Sometime that morning, I just don't recall precisely when, the MPD was pulled off and the BCA took place at the request of both the mayor and the chief of police.
Again, that's Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman taking questions now.